Great Spirit, we pray for rain. We pray for heavy harvests. We pray for a successful hunt. Pray for abundant fish. I really guess share a short song by way of prayer to begin our session. Giwa we ana ne yo hawane ana yo giwa hawane ana he ne yo nata we no ne giwa we ana we yo hawane yo hawane yo hawane yo hawane ana yo giwa we ana ne yo hawane ana yo giwa we ana ne yo hawane ana yo Iwa we ana ne o hawane ana he ne ua. Nata we no ne giwa we ana we o hawane o hawane o hawane o hawane ana yoe. Giwa we ana ne o hawane ana yoe. Giwa we ana ne o hawane ana yoe. Giwa we ana ne o hawane ana he ne ua. Thank you. I'd like to begin by expressing our gratitude to the 13 member states that support this Indigenous Coalition. Australia, Brazil, you're represented today on our panel. Canada, Guatemala, Iran, Japan, Mali, Mexico, Morocco, New Caledonia, New Zealand, Peru, and the United States, as well as the 35 member organizations represented in this coalition. We also want to apologize for not observing proper protocols and permissions from the indigenous communities of this land, from their leaders and elders. We acknowledge the ongoing struggle of indigenous people in Ethiopia and express our regret that we weren't able to come into deeper alignment with them on this occasion. So we'd like to offer space during our interventions for any people who identify as members of these communities to express themselves today and make use of this space. Our opening remarks will be offered by my friend and colleague, Amina Amharic. She is an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for the 2026 to 2028 term, representing the Africa region, president of Akal El Hajeb, and founding member of the Amazigh Community Network Azul in Morocco. Amina represents Azul on the board of the International Land Coalition and is a member of the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance. Mina.
Thank you, Sebi. Excellences, honorable assistants,
Excellencies, honorable attendees, sisters and brothers, thank you for coming together in this vital space. And thank you to all those who have made it possible for us to come together here. I greet you in the spirit of the land, of life, and of continuity. For us indigenous people, this session is not just about food, because we have a global vision. This session for us is about systems, lifestyles, governance, know-hows, ways of being, and transmission among generations for the sustainability of the entire world. Indigenous people protect 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the planet, and this is not just by chance, because we have practices that respect the land and natural resources for the well-being of a healthy environment. Our food systems are resilient, diversified, and rooted in reciprocal relationships between people, seasons, the places, languages, and ceremonies. Since the UN Food Systems Summit that took place in 2021, and as was the case during the Food System Summit in Rome and the recent dialogues that took place in June, we have worked towards a vision so that as indigenous people are not mere stakeholders, but we're right holders. And today we're calling for an effective implementation of these rights, not for hypothetical intentions. We're calling for investments in human rights And we're calling for genuine consultations. Our systems are dynamic, living, and have been developed over centuries of practice. And these are proposals for concrete models for agroecology, for climate resilience, and for intergeneration well-being. And today, and this in all levels, we hope for restitution of land and of natural resources in order to proceed towards ecosystem restoration and for the resurgence of harvests and for economy reconstructions that is fair and humanly acceptable, that have been designed by the leaders of indigenous peoples, the youth, the women, and the safekeepers of knowledge. We believe, or rather we hear about very powerful examples coming from the Amazon, from the Sahel, from the Andes, systems that work to the service of the people. These are not just abstract concepts, but rather practices that work towards collective and responsible governance. This session is a call for ethical partnerships, sincere partnerships as well, partnerships that are respectful of our autonomy, for systems that work towards free and informed consent. This is the guide for us that we're using for a structural change that is culturally sound and a holistic well-being that will help us move towards a transition that is fair, towards a food system that will also be forward-looking. We invite all of the coalitions, all of the institutions and donors and stakeholders to recognize, respect, and protect the values, the approaches, and the knowledge of indigenous people to help the transition of food systems. And we call upon you towards the governance of systems that are currently led by indigenous people. There are three objectives that bring us together today: share our methodologies, strengthen partnerships, and trigger funding. We are working towards policies that will honor the autonomy and the wisdom of indigenous people, while accepting that the future of the food system doesn't need to be reinvented or rethought, but rather recognized, protected, and shared. We need to go beyond just rhetoric, and we need to build a future that is based on culture, on land, on...
Recording in progress.
Because the transformation of food systems will not take place without us. We were never the problem, and the future that we're looking for must be with us, not for us, because we are the solution and the response that is required. Thank you very much for your participation, and we hope that this session will be a turning point and will help us move towards a real shared future. Thank you very much.
Now we'd like to share a video message from our Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Coalition Chair, Aluki Kotier.
Did you know seal meat is considered one of the best sources of iron? Not only is it nutritious, but it is absolutely delicious. When an Inuk hunter successfully hunts a seal and shares it with family and community members, it reinforces and strengthens cultural ties and kinship systems, not to mention honing the hunting skills that are passed down through Indigenous knowledge. Advocacy. Greetings. My name is Aluki Koto. I am the chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. In addition, I am the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Coalition. Although I am not present with you in Addis Ababa, I am so pleased that you are participating in this session focused on the power of Indigenous food systems. I have provided you with one example, but I can assure you that there will be many other examples shared by participants during this session. Moving forward, let us use this time and space to call for actions and partnerships across coalitions and beyond. I hope you a very good session. Did you know seal meat is
Thank you very much. Made me a little hungry. Okay. Now, I wanted to introduce Juan Lucas Restrepo. He's the Director General of the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, based in Rome, Italy. His many roles over the last 25 years include in Colombia, the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, the Executive Director of AgroSavia, the largest agricultural research organization in the country, and the Chief Commercial Officer of the National Federation of Coffee Growers. Thank you.
Good morning to all. Thank you for having us in this very important conversation, this thematic session. So, just as an introduction, we are all here because we are conscious of the urgency of transforming food systems, and we need to acknowledge that driving this transformation requires many hands, and one of the most vital and long undervalued belongs to indigenous peoples. And we've seen through our experience across the continents that their food systems are inherently climate adapted, nutrition rich, and biodiverse. And they can provide valuable lessons to meet SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the Global Biodiversity Framework. These systems that indigenous peoples have managed are dynamic. They continually adapt, they evolve. Their traditional role knowledge is deeply rooted in agroecological principles that in a significant way balance nature with circularity and intergenerational equity. And they are being custodians of countless land races and ancient species that represent today an untapped reservoir for nutrition, climate resilience, and environmental sustainability. There are about 7,000 species that are untapped, and we need to tap on to make sure we meet the food nation goals. However, indigenous peoples are often left out from these systems. They are meant to nourish, and there is great examples on and evidence on how, as they are connected to, for example, school feeding programs grounded in indigenous knowledge that can strengthen not only cultural heritage, but enhance dietary quality and support local economies. And there is a good example, for example, coming from Brazil's national school feeding program, the PNAE, that offers culturally appropriate meals for indigenous students while engaging indigenous farmers as suppliers. There is also a big challenge on the lack of disaggregated data, that marginalization, and where we've seen and have access to that data, we often see disparities that are staggering. So we see, for example, that indigenous peoples often face high rates of anemia and micronutrient deficiencies, which is a paradox that we need to look at, and that this is even happening in high-income countries. And of course, therefore, we need to invest in more disaggregated data collection to inform more targeted nutrition interventions and monitor that progress. We have, for example, engaged in Turkana County in Kenya with the indigenous communities to understand better their dietary habits through participatory video making. And this is bringing the youth communities and that are technologically savvy to help bring the community to help us better understand where those communities are and how they can be part of designing and co-designing solutions for them. So co-creation involving indigenous communities needs to be an important principle. Inclusivity, grounded in free, prior, and informed consent, of course, to proceed with the UN declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples. And then, of course, we need to keep creating more structure and meaningful ways for engagement. It's great to see, for example, again in Kenya, how the Ministry of Environment, Forestry, and Climate Change convened a workshop with indigenous peoples to inform the development of the third National Climate Action Plan. And this allows and has allowed the communities to voice their priorities and adaptation needs, ensuring that those policies are both equitable and grounded in local reality. And of course, we just heard from the chair of the UN Food Systems Indigenous Peoples Coalition, how this grouping is also critical to foster direct dialogue with policymakers, scientists, funders, and amplify the voices of communities, build capacity, and enable meaningful influence over food systems global discussion. So just to close, we need to make sure that we just not include indigenous peoples, but fully recognize them as leaders in shaping the future of food systems and are better able to integrate their knowledge and views in the design of policies, innovations, and solutions. And the path for resilient, nourishing, and just food systems is one that indigenous peoples have been walking for millennia. So let us walk it together with open minds, grounded humility, and a shared path forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. Before we move to our next speaker, I'd like to announce that we do have interpretation available for those of you who have just arrived. Channel 1, English, Channel 2, French, and Channel 3, Spanish. Is that right, Michelle? Okay. I'd like to introduce the radiant Aminata Diallo, is OHCHR 2024 Indigenous Fellow, youth member of the Tin Hanan Association, and part of the Global Aramat Project, an initiative focused on the well-being of Indigenous peoples, biodiversity, and the decolonization of research. She is currently pursuing a master's in generation at the University of Cape Town through the Mandela Rhodes Scholarship.
Thank you, Sebi. And greetings to all gathered here. My name is Aminata Diallo. I am from the Keltamashek and Fulani community in Mali, and I speak as part of the Indigenous People Coalition, a youth member of the Tin Hinan Association, and as a member of the Global Aramat Project under Pathway 4, which is about social justice and reconciliation. Today, I wish to address not only from a platform, but from memory, from the land, from the plate, from what has been passed down and what is at risk of being lost. Food is not just a system to be transformed. It is a way of life to be protected, respected, and restored. Growing up, I remember sitting with my family around a single plate, eating together in a circle. That circle wasn't just about food. It was a way of being. It meant unity, equality, and gratitude. It symbolized our relationship with one another and with the land. Food was not only eaten, but it was also shared, grown together, harvested with prayer, and received with humility. These practices are not just traditions, they are technologies of care. They are mental health, they are environmental protection. They are what keep us alive, not just in body, but in spirit. But today, those ways of life are being fractured. In the Sahel, like in other indigenous territories, we're seeing how conflict, climate change, and land grabs turn food into a weapon. As in the extremely unhuman case of what is going on currently in occupied Palestine. And conflict here does not only mean war, it also means a clash of worldviews, a cosmovision conflict where we see food as a sacred gift. It could also be seen as a commodity or worse, a means to control, punish, or enslave. But the opposite can also be true. Where we move with the seasons, the dominant system imposes fixed borders and export demands. Where our food systems are built on reciprocity and care, dominant models are extractive and linear. This too is violence, slower but deeply corrosive. Youth are disconnected from ancestral knowledge, and elders are dying without passing on. Land is being taken, and so is the right to nourish ourselves in our way. In response, at the Eramat project, which works across more than 70 indigenous communities and 150 partner organizations on 6 continents, we support seed sovereignty, protect sacred food spaces, revive indigenous food governance, and connect youth and elders in co-creating food futures rooted in freedom. Our work is grounded in indigenous law, in spiritual practice, and in practical ancestral knowledge from the soil to the sky. We're not offering a romantic past. We're offering remembrance, presence, hope, and grounded alternatives for the future. And here's what we want our partners to know. We're not asking to be included. We're bringing solutions. We manage 80% of the world biodiversity. We steward lands that are the lungs of the pantry of the planet. We hold knowledge systems that are ecological, ethical, and intergenerational. That is the added value of indigenous peoples. We don't just produce food, we produce balance. So this is a moment to look in the mirror and ask, are we truly building just and sustainable food system, or are we repeating extractive patterns in a new language? Here's how we believe real collaboration should look. First, co-creation. Indigenous peoples must be involved from the start, not invited in as a box to tick. Second is long-term flexible funding for indigenous-led initiatives, research, indigenous-led and nutrition. It is also about identity, ceremony, and peace. This is in a sense of the fourth one, which is cultural and spiritual recognition within those space. And collective governance. Indigenous legal system must be respected alongside national and international ones. To our allies here, governance, donors, institution, we say, walk with us in trust and don't partner with us for optics. Share risk, share power, share time. Food like water is a divine gift. Indigenous people remind us that what is good and pure is not what is extracted, but what is honored, respected, and shared. So this is not just a speech. It is take food as a path to justice and reconciliation, to restore dignity to those most excluded, and to remember that food is not a project. It is life. It is a right. And it is a future we must and can build together. Thank you.
Thank you, Aminata. Next, I'd like to introduce Francisco Rosado May. He's a professor at the Intercultural Maya University in Quintana Roo, Mexico. He holds a PhD in biology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. At Yucatec Maya, Francisco has researched and published several papers on indigenous food systems.
Thank you, Sebi. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to use some slides for my presentation. Thank you. We have heard a lot of philosophy of indigenous peoples. Let me share with you some of the work that we are actually been doing in the academia towards indigenous peoples' food systems. Oops. Okay. I think we all know that our food systems in general are broken today. The data that is already published shows how deep in trouble we are. And that is actually the reason that many organizations, such as this event that we're having here in Ethiopia, are calling for the transformation of those broken food systems. Calls are out and inviting everybody to be part of the transformation of the food systems, meaning towards sustainability. And along those calls, you have also heard in this room and in many others that we must do it in a way of co-creating knowledge. And that's where part of the trick is. When a paper is published by two scholars, that paper is the reflect of co-creation of knowledge. But we have to understand that that paper comes from the co-creation of two same ways of knowing, people from the same scientific training. So we don't think that that's the reason we are using the word co-creation. And also, co-creation is not only addressed to mend broken food systems, like the examples we have in this slide, large-scale industrial agribusiness. We also have to look at how indigenous food systems throughout the world are nowadays. What you're seeing here is Maya people have nowadays. Over 51% of the farmers, Yucatec Maya farmers, have broken systems. So co-creation, the call for co-creation shouldn't be only for conventional agri-food systems. Also, our own indigenous food systems, many of them are broken and need to be transformed in the correct word of transformation through co-creation. And to do the co-creation, we have knowledge, and some of that knowledge is already being published. In 2021, there is this paper published by FAO, the White Wipala paper, which was actually validated by a solid group of scientists saying that the knowledge that is in this book from indigenous peoples has strong scientific value. That is very important. And this is only one example of the scientific validation of indigenous knowledge. There are many other books that came before and after this White Wipala paper. So there is knowledge there. And there is also a lot of knowledge that has not been documented, of course, but there is knowledge. So when we talk about co-creation of knowledge, we would like to agree on a working definition. It's not just a final definition, but a working definition of what it is that we understand by co-creation of knowledge. And it is a process in which different ways of knowing, and this is the critical part of it, ways of knowing. It's not only science, it's other ways of knowing. Some people call indigenous knowledge as science, but many don't science, and everybody has the freedom to call it the way it is. But the reality is that there are different ways of knowing that led to results, that led to information, that led to knowledge that has been documented in some of the books that we've been talking about. But this process takes place in a safe environment in which there is respect. There are values that are connecting the people working in this process of co-creation of knowledge. So this is the first time there is a working definition on co-creation. It's coming from indigenous peoples. And by the way, the term co-creation was pushed really hard in the Summit of Food Systems back in 2021 by indigenous peoples. It is really good to see that it's been adopted now widely. So identifying the most important limiting factors that prevent successful co-creation of knowledge is important. And those factors that we find are, and I think we all are in agreement. Number one, there has to be trust, confidence between the players. And I know that some scientists do not trust, do not think that the knowledge from indigenous peoples is really solid enough to consider it in a process of co-creation. But on the other hand, I know indigenous peoples also are aware that scientists steal knowledge from indigenous people. So we have to build trust in the two parties involved or the other parties involved. And the other part is that co-creation of knowledge brings the issue of transdisciplinarity. And that brings the issue of epistemology. Doing the epistemology of multi is difficult. Doing it in an interdisciplinary approach is even harder. The epistemology is more demanding. And in a transdisciplinary way of it, and in which not only disciplines, scientific disciplines have to go beyond their own boundaries, but culturally speaking also, we have to move beyond our own boundaries. So the epistemology is getting harder every time we move up in the scale. So this is what we propose, that both main issues in the co-creation, the trust, the confidence, and the epistemology can be bridged, can be helped bring it together by identifying values and principles. This is another contribution from indigenous peoples. Identifying values and principles help to bridge these difficulties that I talk about in the process of co-creation of knowledge. And on in my university, with the I'll explain a little bit about the methodology, but we have identified 13 principles and 7 values that can be distributed along all the 4 steps of a process of a project: the planning, the implementation, the data analysis, and the sharing the results. I will be too long to go over these 13 principles and 7 values, but let me just emphasize 2 of these. One of the principles and one of the values actually came from a consultation with indigenous peoples in the Yucatec Maya community. And they were exposed 12 before the 13th one and 6 values before the 7th one. And they said, something is missing here. We are in agreement with these previous 12 principles and 6 values, but there's something missing here. In the principles, there should be a principle in which we commit to the project, to the objective of the project, not necessarily to the funding of the project. So we have to stretch our imagination to figure out ways to find funding or ways to implement a project. But important here is the objective of the project. And in values, they said, we don't see here that a critical value for us is present, and that is the interconnectiveness of things, of the tangible and non-tangible things. So interconnectivity is from the Yucatec Maya people, is a strong value that should be in this process of co-creation of knowledge. How do we come with these 13 principles and 7 values? Is that we had a group of internationally renowned scientists, practitioners from government and international agencies working together in a large meeting that we had in my university. And from their experience, they came out with these 12 and 6 values, 12 principles and 6 values. Then we took them to indigenous communities and we reached the number of 13 principles and 7 values. Then we took it to the non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations, and they validated those 13 principles and 7 values. Now we are ready to bring it to the world. We are going to publish this work. That is the first time it's being done worldwide, led by indigenous people with the financing help of the Global Alliance of the Future of Food. Now we have elements of knowledge. We have way to bridge the issues of trust and epistemology through principles and values. And we have an issue that is being mentioned here. We are losing the people who have the knowledge. And we don't have actually solid academic programs or any other type of training that can pass on that knowledge and the way of knowing in which that knowledge was achieved, was reached. So we need to think about how to co-create very good training programs at different levels, farmer to farmer, all the way to PhDs. From a transdisciplinary point of view, working on indigenous food systems towards mending broken food systems, both in conventional systems and indigenous systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francisco. I'm going to share a little bit more about our farm from a local perspective to provide a local perspective on indigenous farming practices and the values that accompany them. My family has lived and farmed on our ancestral lands in the Chesapeake Bay region, 30 documented in our oral histories. And despite centuries of colonization and displacement, we have been able to hold on to a small part of our original homeland, which is where we grow our ancestral varieties of corn, beans, squash, tobacco, and various fruit and nut trees. Our focus this year is restoring the seed stock of our ancestral corn variety, which is called Pulem, which is critically endangered. And along with that, beginning to decolonize the diet of our community, which includes both my tribal nation and the intertribal urban native community in Washington, D.C., which is nearby. So as part of the Aramat Project's Indigenous-led place-based research project through Capital Native Nations, this food sovereignty project takes a multifaceted approach. So not only are we producing the ancestral foods for our community, but we're bringing the community into the process of regenerative organic food production and preparation, restoring that relationship to the land that has been violently severed. In Piscataway country, tribal members are also replanting our wild rice beds, using fire ecology to restore the health of our forests. We're fishing invasive species, managing the deer population through hunting, and growing our most sacred medicine, which is tobacco. Our community farm is one small point in a web of indigenous-led food sovereignty projects across the world. This web has the potential to change everything. And by bridging rural indigenous tribal nations and urban native communities, because in the US, over half of the Native American population lives in cities, we open the door to cultural reconnection, education, and market opportunities for these special nutrient-dense foods. The legacy of colonialism on American Indian people in the US is recorded on our land and on our bodies. The rates of obesity, diabetes, and other nutrition-related diseases in our tribal communities are the highest in the country, without exaggeration. And this is the result of the systematic destruction of our traditional food systems by the US government and corporate actors. Returning to the foods our grandparents left for us is a process of healing our bodies and the land. Nutrient-dense and minimally processed foods produced by us and for us offers our communities self-determination, not only for our subsistence, but also for economic development in the agricultural sector for rural and tribal people. And as my colleague Aminata brought up earlier, in these spaces, indigenous people are held up as a poster child for regenerative farming practices, climate, and our wisdom and science, as Francisco was saying, it's extracted, it's commodified, and it's tokenized. And on the ground, we're the first to fight. We're the last to benefit from any of the resources that trickle down from the few institutional changes that are made resulting from our sacrifices. So our images are used in fundraising materials and the glossy reports, but the grants always go through intermediaries and gatekeepers, whether they're governments, private sector, or NGOs, rather than directly to the producers. And then the technological solutions, the heavy machinery, the poisons, the genetic engineering, and the synthetic inputs, they've become surrogates for the real solutions to feeding the world. These other technologies have become an addiction, an expensive distraction that is very profitable to a small number of people. But here's the farming technologies can make us all rich with beautiful land, clean water, biodiversity, rich in delicious food, physical health, family, and community, rich in a way that doesn't rely on the poverty of others. Agricultural technologies are the future because they were developed over thousands of years by people for whom sustainability is a pragmatic reality, not a moral question. Our grandparents taught us that every decision we make has to consider the consequences for the next 7 generations. Indigenous people will never trade tomorrow for today because we're bound to our land. Whatever happens to her happens to us. It happens to us first, and then it happens to everyone else. So our food system doesn't need more startups or apps or charities. It needs to invest in what's already working and Indigenous people who have fed the world since time immemorial. It is not a natural condition for our people. And we know our Mother Earth is capable of producing enough healthy food for all 8.2 billion people. Hunger and malnutrition is a weapon of warfare. In most cases, it's a weapon of class warfare. And transformative change requires sacrifice and a spiritual awakening because it's going to piss a lot of powerful people off. And I know that because in my country, I've been arrested 8 times in 8 years for fighting to protect the land and the water. Now I'm focused on protecting it by working the land with my hands. I think jail was easier, but this is a sacrifice that we're proud of as a community. So we need direct funding to Indigenous producers and community-driven projects. For example, I have to repair my tractor. For the money spent on my airfare and hotel to come talk here, I could have probably fixed my tractor. So that about sums it all up. Very much. And like to turn the floor over to Saulo Seolin, who's the General Coordinator of Food Security and Nutrition at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. Worked into the UN, Rome-based agencies between 2004 and 2008, and was an advisor to the Director General of FAO between 2015 and 2017. Saulo is also co-chair of the G20 Task Force for the establishment of a global alliance against hunger and poverty. Thank you for being here with us today.
That clapping was for you. I mean, I haven't started it. Dear friends, colleagues, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to join you today, representing Brazil's Minister of Indigenous Peoples, Mrs. Sonia Guajajara, and the government of Brazil. We thank the organizers for this opportunity for Brazil to contribute to this conversation as a proud member of the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. And on a personal note, I have to say I'm especially happy to be here because I was part of the decision in the coalition. I was pestering the ministry for a long time until they finally decided to do it last year. In Brazil, indigenous food systems hold an increasingly central place in our efforts to promote sustainable, inclusive development. They express the deep connections between people, territory, knowledge, and biodiversity, as Amina and the other colleagues here on the panel have said before. Over generations, indigenous communities have cultivated ways of producing food that care for the land, strengthen social ties, and preserve cultural identity. But these systems have been overlooked or ignored by public policies that reflect indigenous realities. This is beginning to shift in Brazil. Since 2023, we have worked to reshape these policies in dialogue with indigenous organizations. And a significant milestone was the creation of dedicated modality within our national food acquisition program. It is called the Indigenous Food Acquisition Program. In Portuguese, it's the PAA Indígena. So instead of distributing in standard food baskets to indigenous communities, the program now enables public procurement from indigenous farmers and local producers. These foods are delivered directly in schools, in health unities, and community centers. For the past 2 years, nearly 2,800 indigenous farmers supplied more than 3,300 tons of food in 18 states in Brazil. The initiative supported local economies and enhanced food and nutritional security with products aligned with cultural preferences and traditional diets. To make this work, legal changes were needed. There's a little box on the concept note for the session today that explains a bit of it. Indigenous producers can now participate without the same bureaucratic barriers required in conventional supply chains. For example, food produced in collective territories is exempt from sanitary certifications when consumed locally. Identification requirements for the producers were also simplified, and the program is monitored through councils with indigenous representations. And this happens at all levels. At the national level, with the National Council on Food Security and Nutrition, that has a special working group on indigenous food systems, with the participation, of course, of indigenous peoples, but also at the state and municipal levels. School meals are at the core of this change. Has mentioned Brazil's national school feeding program called PNAE, which currently supports over 2,070 indigenous students across more than 3,500 schools. The program includes differentiated financial support for municipalities and states to address logistics. It requires the elaboration of culturally appropriated menus by trained nutritionists and the participation of indigenous representatives in local school meals councils. They are the ones who help to decide what's going to be on the menu. And this also builds capacity at the states and municipal level, especially at the state level. They're not really used to deal with the indigenous producers, with collective production and buying from them. So this has also been a bit of a challenge, but it is resulting in great capacity for these states that I think will last. I would like to mention also the platform Catrapovos Brazil, which has been developed through cooperation between government institutions and indigenous organizations. This is between the organizations and the Office of the Public Defender in Brazil. They have been key to these improvements. It provokes adjustments in the sanitary frameworks so that food produced using traditional methods can be purchased and served in these public programs. Today, this platform is active in 15 states. So it was announced yesterday during the SOFI launch that Brazil has left the map of hunger in record time. In a little less than 3 years, we managed to go from a very high level of food insecurity in the country to being out of the map of hunger, according to FAO, according to SOFI, 2.5%. We're very happy about this, and for this achievement, but also for this type of programs that I'm talking here about, there's really no magic formula. What we say in Brazil is that it's three things. It's a political commitment, it's integrated intersectoral policies, and social participation. The social participation is absolutely important, and it's what I think everybody else has been talking about here. On March last year in Rome, when Minister Sonia Guajajara formally signed Brazil's adhesion to the Indigenous Peoples Food System Coalition, she reaffirmed Brazil's commitment to supporting social bioeconomy and the protection of traditional food knowledge. I would like to quote a sentence from her when in this signing ceremony last year. I quote, "With the implementation of indigenous food systems, which ensure diversified production aligned with the realities and specificities of each people, we are not only guaranteeing food security, we are offering an alternative to monocultures, strengthening soils, generating income, protecting the environment, and promoting health through nutritious diets that prevent disease and malnutrition. End of quote. This vision shapes our actions at national and international levels through both FAO and the WFP, especially the WFP Center of Excellence in Brasilia. Brazil has cooperated with dozens of countries on school meals adapted to local food cultures. As co-chair of the School Meals Coalition, we have worked to promote indigenous participation and visibility. During our G20 presidency in 2024, we launched the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which was mentioned by the Secretary General Guterres yesterday in his opening speech as an example of partnership that can yield concrete results in these difficult times. School meals based on local procurement as one of the central public policies that can be scaled up to advance social inclusion and resilience. And this is not to say that everything is going fine in Brazil. We face many challenges still, not all is perfect. In some territories, infrastructure is insufficient, transportation is very difficult, especially in the most remote regions of the Amazon. Some schools lack adequate facilities. Local governments still need more technical capacity and resources to fully implement these new policies. But the direction is clear. Supporting indigenous food systems means building policies rooted in territory, identity, and the knowledge of those who have long cared for the land. Brazil takes seriously the promise of the Agenda 2030 to leave no one behind. The recognition and support of indigenous food systems is a practical example of that commitment looks like. And just a final word, I would like to tell you all that this work is not driven by government initiative alone, not at all. It results from years of advocacy, dialogue, and insistence from our indigenous peoples. They're the ones leading the way, producing, organizing, educating, and proposing, as Aminata said, grounded solutions that respond to the most urgent challenges of our time. You may count with Brazil. We'll continue walking alongside you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Saulo. We're going to turn back to Amina, who's going to share a little bit more about our coalition's platform.
Merci, Sébi. Merci à tous nos panélistes. Merci à mes amis et frères et sœurs. Merci à vous aussi d'être présents.
Our brothers and sisters, and thank you for being with us today. I would like to talk to you today about a very important framework and an example of co-creation, something that was contributed by the indigenous peoples as an alternative in terms of content, but also methodology. I'm going to talk to you about health determinants. First of all, the Alliance of Determinants of Health is reflection, and it's not an abstract model such as a platform rooted in. It's a platform rooted in real experiences. It was drawn up by indigenous peoples in the sociocultural regions to guide institutions and help them better understand how we see our systems and deal with the concept of well-being and welfare. And the aim is to guide them to incorporate their infrastructure and programs. An exceptional food systems summit and the framework recognizes food systems as intrinsic to health. They're at the center of physical, mental, and spiritual health and embody our intergenerational relationship with land, water, families, and the sacred. It goes above and beyond the absence of illness. It seeks to rebalance life dimensions and reconnect with everything that exists, as Aminata said previously. Based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of all Indigenous Peoples, our framework calls for cultural security in politics and practices. These need to be inclusive, but also respectful laws, values, and systems of indigenous peoples. Through this perspective, indigenous food systems are protection factors linking community resilience cultural continuity and biodiversity. There can't be Indigenous health without an Indigenous food system, and there can be no food sovereignty without territories and natural resources. We need language, ceremony, and collective governance. The framework of determinants of health is mentioned in Decision 1619 of the Convention on Biodiversity, reasserting the role of Indigenous peoples in the conservation and maintenance of biodiversity through traditional knowledge, Indigenous sciences and customs, and features in the WHO report of 2025 on social determinants of health, and it recognizes the structural features and colonization as the fundamental cause of health inequality. Above and beyond advocacy tool, the framework calls for a means of conceiving of systems so that world, national, and local leaders can be responsible for alignment with the objectives set out by the Indigenous peoples, and so that they can implement these in an effective manner as a durable solution to an urgent situation. Food systems are a living example of risk factors of protection is our lives. These are linked to all aspects of Indigenous welfare, health, or spiritual health through ceremonies and harvesting protocols and life cycles. These are fundamental and can be seen through the intergenerational transmission and learnings. Environmental health, seeking to optimize seeds and water. We need to revitalize food economies, and we need to reconsider practices and political health through sovereignty, rights that emanate from treaties and the governance of land and water and natural resources. Together with all of these aspects, framework is a holistic vision seeking to protect Indigenous food systems, but also to unleash all of the transformative potential by way of partnerships based on free consent, free informed consent, calling for structural reform. This framework is the result of 3 studies carried out by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and it provides guidelines on the structure, implementation, and assessment of Indigenous welfare. And the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has recommended that all UN bodies adopt this. That's why we call upon all institutions, including the UN Organization for Food and Agriculture, to adopt this in their internal policies and to support Indigenous means of governance of food, health, and biodiversity. When Indigenous food systems are supported, diversity prospers, as does health, with adequate funding. Indigenous initiatives enable all of this to work, and the Indigenous Determinants of Health framework is an example of this. This needs to be in line with world priorities. As such, we need to incorporate this in our decisions for a better future for food systems. Thank you very much to all of you. I'd just like to recall that The current generation has a responsibility towards future generations. I'm a mother and a woman, and seeing children dying of hunger when their mothers are trying to run and find food for them is totally unacceptable. Food is a right. It's not a weapon to be used against the weakest people. Thank you very much.
We're going to start to bring things together here. We have a synthesis and next steps from our colleague, Hania Mogani, who's an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, regional coordinator at ICCA Consortium, and founding member of the International Environmental Guardians, IEG, legal advisor at Sinesta. She is an Indigenous advocate, legal counsel, community facilitator, educator, and activist working at the interface of science, policy, and society.
Thank you very much, Sebi. Relatives, first of all, I want to tell, as English is not my language, maybe I should be very, very slow. So thanks for your patience. I come from what the maps call Iran, but my identity is far older and wider than any border. Philosophically and spiritually and naturally, I am an indigenous dust in the whole universe. What I and my indigenous sisters and brothers across this earth carry is more than memory. It is an ancestral archive, thousands of years of lived solutions. This memory is not nostalgia. It is a practical key to the crises we face today, especially those surrounding food, territories, and survival. And yet, this ancestral knowledge is under siege. Wars burn the lands it depends on. Borders cut through grazing routes and seed-sharing traditions. And modern forms of colonizations, I mean economic blockade, sanctions, and unilateral coercive measures, silently chuck the systems we have maintained for centuries. But colonization today is not only the obvious sages and sanctions, it is also the relentless march of modern and neo-modern economies. These economies arrived speaking the language of progress, but they erase indigenous food systems, push monocultures where diversity once thrived, and turn our self-sufficient system into supply chain. They leaving indigenous people standing in ruins of markets we did not build, and forced to adapt to solutions that ignore the wisdom we are already hold. I have seen war myself in the recent horrifying conflict in my homeland. I have seen it drains the soil of its fertility and the spirit of its people. And I cannot speak of war without naming other places, such as Gaza, and naming Palestine. Because as we meet here to speak of food systems, Palestinians, farmers, and fisher folks, indigenous to their land, are starving, blockaded, displaced, and silenced. They are not in this room with us. Their absence is our collective failure. Excellencies, colonization never truly ended. It simply changed its tools. Today, it wears the face of sanctions and trade regimes and economic models that call themselves but are anything but.
For Indigenous peoples, these systems are not abstract. They are the invisible fences around on our fields and pastures and territories. Friends, Indigenous peoples make up 5% of the world population, but protect 80% of the biodiversity. We are the seed keepers. We are the herders. We are the fisher folks. We are the forest guardians. Yet we are treated as a footnote in global food policies. And still, how many are missing from this room? Colleagues, if we are serious about transforming food systems, we must end of hunger. We must dismantle modern colonization. We must guarantee Indigenous people seats at the table, not symbolic invitation, but decision-making power. We must protect Indigenous women and youth. We must include the missing voices. For Indigenous people, food is not a commodity. It is ceremony, it is identity, it is continuity. When modern markets, they do not only offer choices, they replace Indigenous people's systems with fragile, extractive ones. When bombs fall, they do not just destroy crops, they break the sacred bond between people and their territories. When sanctions bite, they do not just stop trade, they erase some cultural memory. Our Indigenous food system coalition is more than an alliance. It is the living embodiment of the rights affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially Articles 3 and 18 and 20 and 26, and grounded in instruments like the International Covenants on Economic and Social and Cultural rights. It brings together Indigenous farmers and fisher folks, herders, nomadic pastoralists, and forest guardians around a shared vision. Food sovereignty as a collective human rights. Some support has reached us, and we acknowledge it, but it has been far from enough to meet on what we tasked to do. And here, the heart of the matter. We do not seek to be treated as passive recipients of aid, but as right holders and true partners, as co-designing and co-leading the transformation of food systems. If the board fully understood the value of what Indigenous people safeguard, I mean our seeds, our knowledge, our solutions, the question I think would not even arise. If it would flow naturally as a matter of justice and shared survival. Until that day, we call for direct, adequate, timely, and predictable access to the financing we need, not as charity, but full investment in a partnership that sustains the planet's future. And I want to also read part of our decision at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, that the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food System is critical for Indigenous food sovereignty. The Permanent Forum calls upon states and United Nations entities to provide funding for the coalition. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we open the floor for a few questions and interventions, we wanted to invite some of our friends and allies here to share some words, starting with Carmen Bourbano, the Director of the School Meals Coalition, Secretariat, and Director of the World Food Program's School Meals Service. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, speaking after the panel that just ended is really, really hard. So a lot of the things that I had prepared, I was just wondering, how do I even follow that? First of all, I think just the spontaneous reaction of the appreciation and the admiration for the work that you do. The School Meals Coalition, for those of you that don't know, is a sister coalition to the Indigenous Peoples Food System Coalition. Was so in the 2021 summit, and it encompasses 109 countries and 140 partner organizations that have come together in an objective to ensure that every child around the world receives at least one healthy, nutritious meal in school. And it has a lot of momentum. There's all of these countries have really mobilized to ensure that these programs are nationally financed, that they're self-reliant, that they are reducing dependency on donor support, that they go from small projects to national policies, and that they are enshrined in legal frameworks and policies and rights in countries, including the right to food, including connecting to education policies, to nutrition, to food systems, etc. School meals as a safety net, as a really important social protection platform for children, but also for communities, has been mentioned already in the panel. The example of Brazil, of course, is probably one of the most important ones of a country that has brought this strategy to scale, but also has used it in a way that transforms local food systems, but also connects across to, for example, Indigenous people's food systems and what they can do. So there are examples in various countries right now that are starting to realize that a partnership between the efforts that Indigenous peoples are doing in, as we've just heard, prioritize and put Indigenous people's food systems in the center of the agenda. And how can a policy like school meals be a bridge towards that? And we just heard that from Saulo on what Brazil has done. We know that Canada is looking at a similar model. We know that Colombia is also very much focused on how the school meal program can have a force and put Indigenous peoples at the center of decision making when it comes to their children, their nutrition and where their food comes from, but also making them partners in those development policies at the local level. Countries in Europe and also in Asia, including India and the Philippines and others, that have important examples of how the partnership between a national policy and the force and the wisdom and the knowledge and the trajectory of Indigenous peoples can be connected in policy making and in priority setting, both locally and nationally. So we've been within the context of the School Meals Coalition with our co-chairs, which is France, Finland, and Brazil, trying to connect across the coalitions. Important one, the other one is the Healthy Diets Coalition, the Agroecology Coalition as well, in terms of how do we really move forward with, in specific context, in specific countries where we can start to really work together. I have to say that there's a lot more that can be done. And we really need to do that from now onwards. There's a lot of opportunities, I think. There's several countries that have realized what can be done around this topic of feeding children in schools, but how that can be a very powerful platform for a partnership, for an equal partnership on the table with Indigenous peoples. And all I can say, I think, at this point is we're going to have a summit hosted by Brazil in September for the School Meals Coalition. We have started to discuss how could be highlighted at the summit, but also probably be the starting point of a more substantive partnership moving forward. I think we count on the partnership also with a lot of institutions that are here, including the Rockefeller Foundation, including many others that are supporting this agenda with the with the objective of ensuring that those national programs that are being scaled up by governments are not only feeding children, but are connecting to those local food systems, indigenous food systems, the wisdom of the people that are coming from those lands, and that can do justice to really a more sustainable future. So I think for now, what I would offer this conversation is a commitment from the School Meals Coalition to connect across and to find meaningful ways in which this can continue on this agenda and prioritize it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for being here and for your commitment. I'd like to invite our friend Sarah Farley, the Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation, to also contribute some to our conversation.
Thank you. I will say that I find it incredibly hard to follow the conversation that happens in this space with Indigenous leaders, because the wisdom that you bring to this conversation, the tragedies that you expose in these conversations, touch our souls. So I want to make 4 points. And the first begins with where you start, which is Indigenous leadership is not a choice. It is a requirement. And I think for too long, it has been tokenized. It has been one seat at the table or two, and it should be the center. I think we're observing, we have been slow to learn in the philanthropic and other funder sectors of how essential that is, and how much it confronts the way our structures have been formed, structures atop capitalism and colonialism, and we need to be honest about that. The second, and the incredible comments from our friend from the Universidad de Quintana Roo made this so powerful. The way we arbitrate collaboration and exchange of knowledge so often is exploitative. I think the central call of free, prior, and informed consent is just the beginning, but what you're talking about is a new way, a new orthodoxy for collaboration that I think our brothers and sisters who represent communities are inviting us into, and those of us that sit in positions and institutions like the one I represent really need to respond to that invitation. So I thank you, and I'm proud to say that at the Rockefeller Foundation, with groups like the Indigenous Partnership, like the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities, who are putting forward new paradigms on this kind of collaboration and this mixology of knowledge types between traditional ecological knowledge that we all need to understand and participate in, and other forms of knowledge which we may term science. The third point I'd like to make is that partnerships must be accountable and extractive, as you've spoken to. It is unconscionable that less than 1% of climate finance goes to Indigenous-led efforts. It's unconscionable that less than 1% of philanthropic capital goes to Indigenous-led efforts. Both of those numbers need to change by orders of magnitude. And I would like to show that in our own institution, we are beginning to learn, we are beginning to change, we are beginning to change our portfolios in this direction, guided by such groups as the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, who taught us a lot about how to be better partners. And the fourth point I'd like to make is that, and it was said so powerfully by each of you, food sovereignty is climate action. I think, Hani Mogagni, you said it so beautifully about our systems. The colonial and capitalistic systems have created these invisible fences separating guardians of nature from those who benefit from its exploitation. And I would say, even more profoundly, those are invisible fences separating us from ourselves. And so only through this broader nature, biodiversity, humanity, human development, hunger, children, it is all one puzzle. That's what we're here to understand. That's why we're here as collaborators. That's what we're here to understand from you, who I would say architects of systems thinking. So thank you for your leadership, for teaching us, for being patient with us. We're here with you.
Thank you, Sarah, for being here with us, for your reflections and for your work to steer a big boat a little bit. That's what we need. And I'd also like to invite our friend Oliver Oliveros, the executive coordinator of the Agroecology Coalition. Thanks for being here with us today.
Oh, thanks very much for the opportunity. I really feel humbled and honored to be part of this conversation today because it's bringing the face and the spirit and the food systems that we're talking about. And we talk about food, we look at food as the tangible food that nourishes our stomach. But when we talk about food systems and we talk about, the centrality of what is traditional, what is local, what is indigenous, we need to talk about nourishing also our souls. And I think the conversation that we are having today is a reminder that food is not just about feeding the stomach, it's about feeding our souls, it's feeding our identities, it's feeding our culture, it's feeding our nations. And earlier this year, we've organized a conversation with Land is Life, also with the International Fund for Indigenous Peoples. And I've learned there that the global philanthropy has awarded approximately 700 billion in grants between 2016 and 2020. But out of those grants that are around $10,000, only 0.64%, less than 1%, is benefiting indigenous peoples. Lusicans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Australian Aboriginals, and Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations, Inuit, Merits of Canada, etc. And only 1.5 billion or 33% of the 4.5 billion went directly to indigenous peoples organizations. And most of the funding is concentrated in a few countries and subject areas. So we could see what is already small amount of funding that goes to indigenous peoples already being, smaller and smaller and smaller. And yet, when we talk about in big conferences like this, we talk about the centrality of farmers and producers, the centrality of indigenous peoples, the role of youth, the role of women. Those do not necessarily translate into investments, into funding. And I think since we are here in the UN Food System Summit, and we know that one of those mechanisms, tools to transformations is through the coalitions of actions. And we have here the Agriculture Coalition, Indigenous Food Systems, the School Meals Coalitions. I know that there is somewhere Healthy Diets Coalition. We have Land Soil Health Coalition, the Resilient Climate Alliance Food Systems. I think we need to harness these mechanisms that is offered to us, and that is coalitions of the willing. And we need to continuously ask and demand from all these coalitions to look at indigenous peoples driven and inspired initiatives and actions. We have heard about it earlier that agroecology, for example, is nothing new. This is what indigenous peoples and local communities all along. They continue to survive hundreds and thousands of years already. And yet, resources that are flowing to support and recognize and value those practices remain token at best. And so I think it's all our collective responsibility as participants of this Food System Summit, as participants of this very session, to make sure that what we've heard today really is extended and amplified in the other sessions that we will be attending and in the other conferences that we'll be attending, and more particularly in our own program of work in our respective organizations and coalitions. So together with our sister coalitions, the School Meals, the Healthy Diets Coalitions, and Indigenous Peoples Coalition, you can count on us in making sure that we're integrating what you're already offering as effective solutions to transform our food systems. And we've started doing that. A few days ago, on Saturday, we've had this convening with our friends, Dollar Foundation, and with the three other coalitions, where we started really talking about, how do we overlay our respective priorities and initiatives to make sure that the things that we are doing, we're adding value and adding value and making use of the resources that are available more strategically, more meaningfully, and more impactful. And so please continue to demand from all of the coalitions, from all of the actions, and from all the initiatives, the importance of really valuing and recognizing. And recognition means also seeing those translated into dollars and euros. Continue to demanding that and hold everybody accountability and making sure that, next time we talk in the next Food System Summit, we'll see, something that is really concrete that is happening. So thanks for having us for today. And please continue to demand us all accountable on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. I'd like to open the floor for any interventions offered by our friends gathered here today.
I will speak in Spanish.
Dale.
Mi nombre es Jennifer Mojica Flores, soy embajadora de Colombia.
My name is Jennifer Morris Flores, ambassador of Colombia for the UN agencies based in Rome. I would like to greet you on behalf of the Colombian government. It's an honor for me to participate in this meeting, and I thank the organizers for this meeting. Colombia is a country that has a very huge responsibility when it comes to this particular subject. We have been working with Guatemala to co-chair group of indigenous people in Rome. This group that was constituted in 2021 brings together various people in a participative way, indigenous leaders coming from 7 biocultural regions across the world. And we come together, we meet regularly to lead reflections in order to draw hope on various issues. We have about 115 indigenous people in Colombia, and since 1991, we have been taking actions to recognize the rights of indigenous people. We recognize their land, and we also recognize indigenous leaders at the same level as other authorities. Our land register also recognizes their rights and their participation. We were also the chair of the Biodiversity Cup in Cali, and we've been driving change on biodiversity, namely with the Article J, and we've also been instrumental in creating a subsidiary body on indigenous people's rights. We wish to draw upon our conviction that indigenous people have an unreplaceable, unsubstitutable role when it comes to biodiversity protection. Colombia and other countries to adopt a biocentric approach where nature is not a mere object, but also is recognized that has rights and is the very source of life. We would like to underline the interconnections between ecosystems and also based on the cosmic nature of indigenous people and their practices. This is the very fundamental basis of the Kunming-Montreal Convention on Biodiversity. Colombia, as well as the Rome-based UN agencies, will continue to fight for the recognition of indigenous people, their right to self-governance, the universal recognition as well of indigenous people in order to raise hope for humanity's sake. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your contribution and your actions from Colombia's side, and we're happy to see you here. We were able to discover agricultural models and cooperative models from Colombia that can be an example for many countries across the world. Colombia is, in fact, at the forefront when it comes to indigenous people's rights. We saw that in October, and we really felt at home when we came there. And so thank you very much for having shared your experience with us. In fact, I would like to take this opportunity to tell you that we'll be organizing the second Intergovernmental Conference on Rural Development next year in Cartagena. This will be in partnership with the Brazilian government, and this conference seeks to review in this international context of crises and conflicts the roadmap when it comes to access to land and food security. And we would like to have an active participation from indigenous people in these discussions, because their wisdom will be instrumental to define the roadmaps for multilateral agencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this meeting and for these reflections. I would like to share with you a statement on behalf of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Michael, unfortunately, cannot be here. This statement is of the UN Food System Summit and is also endorsed by the working group of peasants and other people working in rural areas. So when we are talking about transforming food systems, we are talking about eliminating hunger and malnutrition while facing climate change, biodiversity degradation, and pollution. Food systems must, above all, ensure that every person can enjoy the right to adequate food. The right to food not only provides a legal framework that ensures coherence, but realizing the right to food makes it easier to eliminate hunger and malnutrition in a way that is fair and just. Such a task needs at least three following issues that should be at the center of the agenda. 1, conflict and protracted crisis. 2, legal binding measures to curtail corporate power. 3, a multilateral process strengthened by meaningful and effective participation by civil society, peasants, and indigenous peoples. Without addressing these issues, there will be no food systems transformation on a global scale, but instead a patchwork of projects with different levels of success. 1, conflict and protracted crisis. Conflicts are leading cause of hunger in the world, and where there is hunger, there is often conflict around the corner. In fact, this conference is being close to the largest famine in modern history. Both sides of the civil war in Sudan are using starvation tactics against civilians. 24.6 million people, about half the population, are experiencing acute food insecurity. And the Sudanese civil war has led to unprecedented displacement, with 8.6 million people internally displaced and nearly 4 million forced to flee across borders. Not far from Sudan is Gaza, where Israel has the fastest starvation campaign in history. This is starvation at genocidal level, and the world does nothing to stop 2.3 million Palestinians from suffering and dying. We could go on about different places in the world, such as Haiti, Myanmar, or Yemen. Land is the center of most conflicts and protracted crises. Therefore, the discussions and decisions regarding agrarian reform at upcoming ICART plus 20 conference that Ambassador was mentioning in Colombia could be one of the more important political events when it comes to the right to food. With all this in mind, I want to leave you with a question to think about. How can investments in food systems address the main cause of hunger, namely conflict and protracted crisis? 2, curtailing power. I welcome the fact that the summit process now makes room to address corporate accountabilities. This recognizes the fact that corporations dominate many food markets and power is concentrated in the hands of the few. Corporations have created food systems that are bad for the environment, bad for human health, and make it difficult for peasants and workers to produce food, have a livelihood, and live with dignity. But after years of experience, we see that general principles and voluntary codes have not done enough to stop corporations from causing human rights and environmental violation in food systems. The problems have been getting worse. So what is needed is a discussion of legally binding measures in national and international law. Realizing the right to food requires mechanism to redress violation. So legally binding measures must include provisions for regulations, remedies, and reparations. 3, meaningful and effective participation to conclude. The summit process will still gather a significant amount regarding the inclusion of rights holders. Hundreds of organizations who tried to engage have decided instead to boycott the UN Food System Summit +4. They feel like even if they came, their participation would not have any substantive impact. What is needed are clearer procedural rules, more transparency in the decision-making process and the agenda setting, meaningful and effective participation with priority granted to the most marginalized. So if we want to transform food systems without multiplying inequalities, it's now more urgent than ever to ground the transformation in the clear shared language of international human rights law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more very brief comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Bibi La Luz. I am with a colleague from Colombia. Please also consider civil society and the further dialogues that you're going to be doing. I am the founder of an organization in Guatemala called Eat Better Waic, or in Español, Come Mejor Waic, where Waic in Maya Quiche language, another Maya language from our vicinity, from Mexico, means to eat. But it is to eat with an interpretation, to eat a healthy and nutritious meal. So in 4 letters combined, we have all of this knowledge and health towards the people. WAIC, what it does is that it promotes reduction of malnutrition through creative and inclusive education, from grassroots communities all the way to here where we're at today. And it's to bring knowledge and empowerment to people on being healthier in the food decisions that they produce and consume. We've been around for 10 years. And my point here is that we did an independent dialogue 4 years ago for the pre-summit and presented in Rome, called very casually, improving our food by turning the tortilla around, and us too. So I think this is what I would love for us to bring it down, right? From very technical terms into more casual and understandable words and narratives for the people that are surrounding us. And as you know, corn in Mayan cosmovision is where men and women were born from. So our basis is corn and everything revolves around that. But monocrops and this sacred food into a genetically modified or very infested with pesticides and a pervasive way of them turning the tortilla around and not necessarily the way that it's supposed to be. And so my question to you, I don't know if we have time to answer it, but to have it here, is that how can we turn the tortilla around for big companies and big monocultures that have been around for ages, or at least very dominated by a small number of families that have altered these crops into bringing it back into what is sacred and what is healthy and what is from our ancestry. So yes, I leave you with this question, not only a question, but also an action to take, because it's very difficult to shift how it's this paradigm years, and how it can be profitable and to have yields in this ancestral knowledge back. Thank you.
Thank you, Bibi. Thank you. It's definitely something to think about, and would love to chat with you after the session. I'm going to turn the floor back to Hania to offer some closing words so that we can end today.
Okay, yes. So to be rapid, I should read from my laptop. For too long, the architectures of global food systems has been shaped by colonial and patriarchal logics that this empowered indigenous peoples and their communities, breaking the very relationships with territories of life, water, and seeds that once sustained balance. We gather here to insist on something different. A transformation in intercultural co-creation, a genuine weaving together of indigenous people's knowledge and contemporary science. But this must not be an uncritical merging. We must always ask for whom, how, and with what consequences. Because true co-creation is not just about blending techniques. It is about strengthening grassroots innovation and the cultural values that underpin them. It is about ensuring that every solution serves emancipatory social projects, not new forms of appropriation. We have learned hard lessons. When the 2021 UN Food System Summit called for more food systems, we indigenous peoples replied, our food systems already are nature positive. We were politely asked for evidence. So we produced it. The Indigenous Partnership for Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty, together with FAO's Agroecology Unit, adapted and transformed FAO's TAPE methodology. Our youth, the knowledge makers for tomorrow, were trained to lead the work. Across 16 indigenous landscapes in northern Thailand, northern India, Kenya, and Mexico, we engaged nearly 500 households. We found what we always knew. Indigenous people's food systems sustain biodiversity, enhance nutrition, and resilience. This study, that enriched it, affirmed that indigenous food systems are not only sustainable practices, they are living ethics, grounded in solidarity, reciprocity, and respect for nature. And they carry responsibilities to shape, protect, and sustain for generations to come. But we cannot ignore the realities. Land appropriation by governments and corporate institutions is advancing aggressively. Contemporary science, unless transformed and democratized, risks becoming an instrument of corporate theft, stealing not only seeds, but the very stories and esprit of our knowledge. The June 20 follow-up webinar on intercultural knowledge reminds us we as indigenous peoples have the responsibility to educate the other side. The open pathway for trust in the youth and children of today, and to ensure that knowledge circulates freely among them. So it cannot be locked away behind patents and paywalls. This is why the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food System matters. Born after the 2021 summit, through the relentless efforts of Indigenous leaders, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, 7 supportive member states, key UN agencies, and our sister coalitions, It remains one of the coalitions still very active and the only one centered entirely on Indigenous peoples. It is more than a platform, it's a movement where Indigenous peoples, government agencies, and allies co-create and co-decide. From supporting pastoralist food system to advocating for Indigenous-led ecosystem restoration to championing culturally grounded school meal program, it works because it is built with us, not for us. But let me be honest, we are asking to be seen and funded as rights holders and partners, not as beneficiaries. If the world truly understood the value of Indigenous peoples' food systems, the seeds we have saved, the ecosystems we protect, the solutions we carry, resourcing would not be a question. It would flow naturally. Until that day, we must call for direct, predictable access to the funds we need. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, food systems transformation will not come from templates or closed door policies. It will come from templates of solutions rooted in our lands and cultures. Let this summit mark a turning point where we stop treating Indigenous peoples as an afterthought and start building with them at the center. Because as we have said before, and will say until it is fully heard, nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Amen. Speakers, can you please stay in this area? We're going to get a group picture before we end. And everybody else, thank you so much for being here and have a great day.
Thank you, sir.
Recording stopped.